Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Today we are recording from Astoria, Queens, London, England, and Bellingham, Washington. Our guest is Kris Jenkins. Kris, introduce yourself.
Ooh, put on the spot immediately. Okay, my name's Kris Jenkins. I have been programming since I was 10, I think. I got my first computer when I was 10. I've really never looked back. I've been tinkering with computers my whole life and my whole career. Mixture of financial services stuff, a lot of different startups along the way. Recently, a lot of Kafka, big data systems, and a heck of a lot of functional programming, which is one of my passions.
Programming since you were 10. What was the first platform?
It's so old. I can't even. So I think there's a company that you guys call Radio Shack, right?
Once upon a time. It's pretty much
Once upon a
out of
time. This
business
is
now.
going
Yeah.
way back. And they used to produce like here's 8-bit microprocessor and like different ways you can wire it up yourself and like almost like didn't look too far from a bunch of switches and a Morse code tapper. And I
Wow.
got one of those
Okay.
on my 10th birthday, and it would come with listings, and I remember the manual teaching you long division in binary, and that's how nerdy a teenager I was. I actually sat down and learnt it.
Somehow I feel like that never changed. The
Yeah.
well,
The only
mine.
difference is people started paying me for it.
That's right. Mine was the Commodore 64. And what had
Oh yeah,
happened,
yeah.
I was in fourth grade, which is about 10, and they had us go in, uh, once every Thursday or something for an hour, and they taught you basic. And then
Oh,
later in life, I got a VIC 20, which is obviously, it was lower than the 64, but that actually came home with me. And I
oh,
remember
nice.
writing basic programs, recording to standard cassette tapes. I
Yeah.
remember I can't remember what the name of the program was, but it was basically a compression program that allowed you to compress your code onto the tape so you had more space on the cassette tape. Obviously hooked up to an old standard definition television, that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then I literally didn't touch computers again until I was like 19.
Oh,
I
really?
Yeah, I didn't get back into them until I was working for a bookstore called Powell's Books, which is actually the largest freestanding bookstore in the world, or at least it was. Um, and I was working at the technical bookstore, and they needed a special order database. This is back in the days of, Clipper and DBase 4.
Hmm.
And I said, I'll write it. And they said, do you have any experience? And I just looked around at all the books. So I learned DBase and Clipper and all these things right there from books, trial and error, and then moved into Linux from that. Uh,
Ah, yeah.
yeah. So let's talk about you talked about your where you started programming, but you know what's your actual background, and like when you started programming, what was your muse? What did you want to be when you grew up? That kind of thing.
God, when I what I wanted to be when I grew up was initially a doctor as a kid, and then I got my first sight of actual blood and changed career paths completely. I'm way too squeamish for that.
Well,
Um, but like programming it was never so much a career path as a fascination. Right. I was always writing little programs and playing games all the way up until university, and I took a computer science degree just because it interested me. And it wasn't until I graduated from university and thought, what am I going to do with myself, that I actually realized people would pay me to write programs. And I thought that was a great thing. This was an obvious built-in career because it's what I'm going to do in my spare time anyway. And I got a job working with a company that sold software. If you were a stockbroking house and you wanted to trade with the London Stock Exchange,
mhm.
you might have bought their software as a kind of communications accounting package. And I cut my teeth there as a budding programmer, and learned all about like Linux and Oracle and C and a number of other esoteric languages along the way.
Well,
I
speaking of
don't know if you've ever.
esoteric, go ahead.
I
Which
don't
one
know
were
if
you
you've ever
running
dealt with the Swift protocol.
Yes, absolutely. For
Yeah,
wire
that's
transfers.
that's a nasty one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like it's almost a snapshot in time of what we thought programming should be like back then. Let's build the best communication protocol ever. All it needs is a 200-page manual.
Well, I mean, I've dealt with EDI, and
Yeah.
then there's of course the idea that when XML became like a thing, obviously it's still a
Yeah.
thing everywhere. People don't realize they're using it, but they are. I remember when that was going to be the protocol. I wrote a book of all things.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, using Emacs. I have not used
Still
Emacs
an Emacs
since.
user over here. Thank you.
I haven't used Emacs since. It was, don't get me wrong, I completely understand the draw to it, but if I want to run an operating system on an operating system, it's so I can play games.
Okay,
So
fair enough.
it's just I don't need Emacs. And if it makes you feel any better, I don't like Vim either or Vi. I went through a state uh, when I was running around with a vacuum and a screwdriver doing computer maintenance on very old Xenix and SCO machines. And the only editor at the time was Ed.
Oh
And
yeah, the one
if
you
you know
accidentally slip into sometimes when the box
that,
isn't set
yes,
up
you
correctly.
accidentally slip into
Yeah.
it. Now, if you know the keystrokes for Ed, you know the keystrokes for Vi. But I
Mm.
don't like Vi because I shouldn't be told that I shouldn't have to tell the editor that I'm editing because it's an editor. Okay? I just don't. So at the console to this day, and it's been since like 1990, oh, five, maybe six, is Joe. I use Joe.
Joe.
Yeah. And I
God.
recently started using VS Code, but that's just because I'm interacting with GitHub more, and VS Code works real well with GitHub.
Yeah, it does. I've been trying. I think I'm on my like sixth or seventh attempt to make friends with VS Code, and I'll let you know how it's going in a few weeks' time.
I use it specifically for, I don't code in it. I use it for writing documentation and submitting pull requests. I know why people use it. I get it. Um, but it's very hard when you're an individual who used to be able to install Red Hat Linux without a screen because he memorized the prompts, to convince him to learn yet again another thing, right? If I'm going to learn another thing, it's going to be a better way to permaculture. I don't need more technology.
Fair enough.
For yourself, you said a doctor, a lawyer, or architect here. I'm not sure why I know exactly why that didn't. Um, what's something you're passionate outside of out of work, out of programming? What's something you love, something that you really put energy into?
Oh, my consuming hobby, and at one stage I thought I was going to try and make a career out of it, is music.
Oh, lovely.
Um, I used to be a guitarist in a band at university, which is great fun, great way to make beer money. Um, and I've done a bit of jazz piano. These days, I mostly do electronic music.
Okay.
So, like, I'm currently working on a fun project that's going to connect the London Underground tube metro system, the
Mhm.
real-time data from that, through Kafka to a bank of synthesizers. I'm going to try and get the underground to play music for us.
Very cool and nerdy.
Yeah, unashamedly.
No, absolutely cool. Now, I love music. I am a huge consumer of music. I actually, a gift that I have is that I can match tenor of people singing or tone.
Yeah.
But I can't read music, and I don't pretend to be a singer. But um, the first instrument I ever played was the xylophone of all things.
Yeah.
Um, and then I moved on to trumpet, and then I went to piano because of the xylophone. The keying's the same.
Hmm.
Um, and then I kind of fell off, but the one thing that has stayed constant is if I'm angry, if I'm sad, if I'm happy, if I need motivation, it doesn't matter what it is. Outside of my wife, the only thing that brings me the ability to get out of that funk, whatever the funk
Yeah.
is music. And I used to be fairly narrow when I was, we were young, we had either punk or alternative, or maybe you were heavy metal or whatever, but that's what you stuck with.
Yeah.
Now I'm all over the place. I'm anywhere from jazz to classical, um, very stereotypical, but oddly not with where I am. Country music has really gotten into my heart recently. U.S.
Oh,
country music,
really?
yeah. Um, Hands down, though, the number one band in the world forever and ever, regardless of Led Zeppelin, whom I love, is U2.
You too. Oh, yeah. I love some of
Yes.
their stuff. Yeah.
Well, they
They
came
can
into my
seriously rock.
yeah. Well, they came into my life like I was 15, right? So
Hmm.
right at that moment, right before I grew 6 inches over a summer, they came into my life. And a few years ago, when they launched their Song of Innocence tour as a birthday in Vancouver, BC, as
Hmm.
a birthday gift, Amanda Nystrom, my wife, she bought me front row seats at the launch
Wow.
of that tour.
Those
And
can't
now,
have been
yeah,
cheap either.
no, it wasn't cheap, and it was one of those things where they opened up at the last minute. They opened up this one row, and she got them. And if you actually watch the YouTube video, you can see us. I mean,
No way.
every time I see it, I'm like, oh, I'm 16 again. And I'm nowhere near
Nice.
that, but that feeling, that just deep
Yeah.
feeling of theirs.
It can
Um,
touch you somewhere in a way that nothing else can. Good music, right? It just gets to
no,
your core.
absolutely, and if you're smart about it, it can help guide you down a path. So a good example is if and if I'm trying to focus, because I work, Amanda and I work in the same office, and usually we're very collaborative, but
Hmm.
sometimes we need to zone in, and she's working on something and I'm working on something, and we just got to get it done, and we're busy, we just need no distractions.
Hmm.
So I'll put in my earbuds, which I'm using for this podcast, and I will listen to either EDM, or I'll listen to old school alt, punk, like My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, something like that. And just something that's constant, beats per minute, is consistent, and it just gets you in this groove.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the things I've learned as I've gotten older is when if you're feeling down, if you don't want to feel down, right? If you want to feel down, just open the whiskey. If you don't want to feel down, if you're trying to get out of it and you can't figure out how, you play some upbeat music that is just positive, and it just pulls you out of the depths of whatever you're feeling, and can just get you moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. Equally, sometimes, you're feeling down, it's the right time to feel it, and the right music can just help you not be alone with it, right?
You can help you bawl your eyes out.
Yeah.
And
There are a
sometimes that
couple of
has to happen.
like sometimes I stick on REM's Automatic for the People for that.
Oh
That's a
my.
certain vibe.
Yep,
That's a great
absolutely.
album.
Okay, so let's talk about your career trajectory. You wanted to be a doctor. You love
Very briefly.
music. Very briefly, until you found out you were
Yeah.
squeamish. It's funny. I'm not squeamish except for two things:
Mm.
needles and spiders.
Oh, okay.
So,
I don't
and go ahead.
I don't love needles. I don't mind spiders at all, but the crimson stuff, that goes right through me every time.
So the needle thing is weird. Like, I pierced my own ears when I was a kid. It doesn't bother me. It's when someone
Oh.
comes at me with a needle. I have to brace myself, look away, take deep breaths. And the spider thing, I just turn into an 8-year-old girl and jump up on a table. It's just ridiculous. um, but you know, you've had a you've been doing this longer than I have, it appears, with considering the 8-bit controller. Um,
Oh, I think we're in a competition there, but yeah, let's say we go back old school.
okay. And tell me, how did you got into finance, programming with finance, but now we're
Hmm.
talking about, you got Postgres, you got Kafka in the cloud, Clojure, and Haskell, which talk about obscure languages, and functional programming. Talk to me about it. What is your draw here? Why is Postgres your favorite database?
I think like the thing with Postgres is it's just a really, really well designed, solid relational database. And a relational database has its limitations, particularly when you go above one machine. I think that model doesn't seem to work very well. But as long as you're within one machine, a relational database is an incredibly flexible thing. It's really quite good at transactions and analytics and all sorts of data modeling use cases, right? And Postgres is the best of breed of that model, as far as I can tell. And it's free on top. So, if you're looking for a database, and nearly every software project is, and you don't know anything about the specifics, I mean, Postgres needs to be in your toolbox as a go-to.
Well, I would agree. I mean, I've been using Postgres, well, since before PostgreSQL. My first Postgres was Postgres 95. I actually used Ingress for a time too, but that was more for
Oh yeah.
research.
Hmm.
And obviously, any of my listeners are like, well, he's biased for Postgres. Of course I am, right? I run Postgres. I'm I'm the founder of Postgres Conference, founder of United States PostgreSQL. But I do think, it's funny you brought up as long as you're in one machine. Now, there is no doubt that they make continued strides at scaling up with Postgres.
Yeah.
But there are technologies that are Postgres based that have shown promise in the past as well as now. There was one called Translattice, which no longer exists, got folded into, I think, Cisco or something like that. There's Yugabyte, which is a newer player. They're about 7 years old, but they're been getting their traction through the pandemic and now. And then of course Greenplum, which is old school. They've been doing multi-machine Postgres for, good Lord, since at least 15 years, maybe more. Greenplum is the most interesting to me because it's the only database that I know of that's open source that can handle petabytes of data easily. And they're quick. For a long time it was a fork. I mean, it's always going to be a fork, but it was a very specific type of fork, and they are trying to move to code parity now. So they'll only be, say, 6 months or a version behind for every release once they get there. I think their open source version is based on 11 now, I think. So they're getting there. And I think they'll catch up. I talk to a lot of people, and like, VMware will never catch up. I'm like, are you kidding me? It's VMware. They Fortune 50 company, and they just got bought by Broadcom. They got plenty of resources. That's not the problem.
Yeah.
And the changes in Postgres now, right? For a long time, the changes were fundamental, right? When you went from 7.1 to 7.2, all of a sudden vacuum was no longer blocking. When you went from 8.2 to 8.3, you no longer had implicit casts. When you went from 8.3 to 9.0, you started getting, for 8.3 brought warm standby, and then very soon after, I think it was 9.2, we got hot standby. 9.6 was a huge release because we got after, parallel workers, things like that. But now fundamental architecture changes are starting to slow. And now we're starting to see more incremental, adaptive improvements. And you can see that like with 15. The only real, in my opinion, I'll just put that out there so that people don't flame me. The only real major feature in 15 was the addition of merge. Everything else was an evolution. So, for example, in 15, you can now have clause-based logical replication so that you can have a row filter that says only replicate this to this subscription if the ID equals 5 or above. Right? And if it's 4 or below, go to this other instance. You can do things like that now. But that was incremental upon the major foundations of what was already built for logical replication. Whereas merge was a heavy lifted, they've been talking about it for a decade trying to figure out how to get this done. And I think we're going to continue to see that 16, 17. I mean, I think we're just going to start seeing continued improvement, finessing, elegance within the existing code base.
Yeah. And I think that's that's almost necessarily part of a long-standing maturing project. And Postgres is very long-standing and very mature and
Yes.
very polished. But when you mention like fundamental changes, I think that's really the issue for me, because like it's not Postgres per se, but I think fundamentally there's something about a relational database model that makes it very hard to convincingly move beyond one machine. And in order to scale over several machines to a large cluster, I think you need a change of architecture as much as you need better implementation, more than you need better implementation.
Well, I don't think you're incorrect. I mean, so Greenplum, for example, it actually can it can break down the query from the planner and send requests to different nodes to get the data based on the query itself. And in that vein, oftentimes it will have multiple copies of one data set, right?
Mm.
And the reason they're doing that is to scale up because you're dealing with so much data. You can also have partial sets too.
Yeah.
And Yugabyte has run into this in that there's certain properties within a single system, ACID compliance, for example, which becomes difficult as you spread out, right? You end up in a more of
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
eventual consistency environment. But I don't think it breaks the relational model or the thought process there, because if it's done correctly, the developer never sees that. They just ask for X and they get back X. The database handles that. I think more fundamentally, you're talking about hardware architecture and technology. It was a lot more complicated 10 years ago. We didn't have the network broadband internally that we do now. I mean, the ability to run 10 gigabit over multiple interfaces to get 100 gigabit is, pretty astounding. I mean, you can get network to go almost as fast as disk at this point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do agree with you. I mean, when you start talking about ACID compliance, atomic commits, that gets it much more challenging in that you're waiting for something, right?
Yeah.
So there is some sacrifices, but I don't know that that changes the relational model as much as it makes, as long as you're aware of the sacrifices that you're making, right? The relational model, to me, what makes it, no, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, but that contradicts what you just said. Like you said it shouldn't affect the developer in almost the same breath as long as you're aware of these compromises that you're going to have to face as a developer.
Fair
You know,
enough.
and I think that abstraction does leak up into developer space. And you can say, okay, well, that's fair enough. We've got to take that on the chin in return for spreading over multiple machines.
Well,
Um,
Well, in that vein, so let me be clear. I prefer why I prefer one machine with asynchronous hot standby, right? Because if the machine goes down, I want something to back me up.
yeah,
But and nowadays, I mean, it, you can get machines with 256 cores, right? So I think I think whether it is a rare individual that needs to actually spread out, right? Because you can go so far up. And with disk, whether it be spent, well, not spinning, but the new SSDs and NVMEs, they're just so fast. Like I don't know if you've ever looked into the specs for some of the Intel data center SSD stuff, but it's ridiculous. I mean, it is borderline RAM speed, and it's just
right.
it's amazing. I mean, I remember my first machine that I ever built and sold was a 486DX266 with 16 meg of RAM and a 1 gig hard drive. 1 gig hard drive,
Okay.
right?
I can
So
probably out old you there. I remember the first memory upgrade I bought was 0.5 MB, and it was a chip about the size of a piece of toast.
yes, that does make you older than me. All right, so we've loved on Postgres. It's not hard to love on
Mm,
Postgres.
yeah.
It's the technology itself is well rounded, like you said. It's a very mature project that continues to innovate. It has a great developer community. It has a great ecosystem. But there are other things that we've got going on here now. Kafka in the cloud. Talk to me about that. What's your draw there?
Well, so I think we're also going to talk a bit about functional programming. So let me connect these two. I think Postgres, the relational model, is a great model, and it will always be in my toolbox, and I think it should be in everybody's toolbox. But if you've only got one way of solving problems, be they database or programming, then you don't have nearly as much flexibility as having multiple ways of thinking. Not just knowing Postgres and MySQL, or just knowing Java and Python, but having different programming models, having different data management models in your head, fundamentally different ways of solving problems.
So let me be clear here. MySQL and Postgres in the same sentence are just that's a null pointer error.
No. Okay, let's thrash that out then. I've clearly gone too far too fast.
Now, first, I have nothing against MySQL. It serves a community. They like it, and that's what matters. Okay? I have a problem when people equate MySQL and Postgres. They are different ideologies. They're only the same technology in the most remote sense of the word, in that they're relational databases. But I mean, I could say the same thing about Informix, which is actually old Postgres based. Back in the day, quote unquote, there was a time when MySQL would stomp all over Postgres. There's no arguing that. Postgres was still getting its feet under it. But nowadays, I would put using both as the same workload. I would put Postgres against MySQL, and then I would say bring on Oracle.
And let's be fair, back in the day when MySQL would be a lot faster than Postgres, it would have pretty good chance of losing all your data occasionally.
Well, that's true too. To be fair, that is true.
Anyone can do fast if those are the guarantees you're offering.
Yeah, I think it's more along the lines for me that whenever anybody equates MySQL to Postgres, it's more that, yes, Postgres could do what MySQL can do, but MySQL can't necessarily do what Postgres can do. Whereas if you say Oracle, Postgres can do, as long as we're not talking about their multi-master thing, I forget what it's called. If we're talking a Postgres instance against an Oracle instance, Postgres can do everything an Oracle can do except for like 2%. And it's a very specific 2%. So if you want to say MySQL and Postgres are both great open source databases, right there with you. But I don't think that they're comparatives. It'd be just like saying, because SQLite's a great SQL database, but it can't be compared to Postgres either.
But so the way in which I mean it is there's something about Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, and even SQLite. Some way you can stick those all in a Venn diagram where Mongo is definitely in a different circle on the diagram.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's before we even discuss quality or feature set. The fundamental mental model of how you build stuff on them is different.
Yes. I mean, hands down. I mean, with Mongo, you're using, JSON for basically everything.
Yeah. And it's basically a key value store, right?
Right.
It's hard.
I will say this, I'm not a big fan of their technology just because I come from the relational era. But I will say this, I had their CTO, Mark Porter, on this podcast. And he is a fantastic interviewee, fantastic guest, but brilliant-minded, brilliant person. And although we did talk about MongoDB, we did 2 episodes because what we really got into was being a good professional, being a good human, how to manage teams, how to get through all that type of stuff, which is for a technical person that ends up in management, that's one of the largest challenges, I would think, is managing teams, people, because all people, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you voted for Trump. I don't care if you follow the Royals. I don't care if you hate Biden. I don't care. We are all screwed up. All of us. You cannot save it. We are screwed up.
Yeah, maybe that's a bit more traumatized than I've been by life, but yeah, I know where you're going.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the point is that we all have our stuff. We all have our stuff we don't talk about. We all have our breakups we never got over. We all have that, I didn't do this. Let me be very clear. I didn't do this. We all have that family secret about the kid who put the hamster in the microwave. It wasn't me. Okay. But I mean, everybody has something,
Yeah, yeah.
and that was the great part about that conversation. All right, so we went from Postgres, and I tried to get you to talk about Kafka in the cloud, but you said something about functional programming and the fact that we need different paradigms to give us different perspectives. Can you expound on that?
So one way to think about it is, so I had this company that I co-founded. I was CTO of it for 10 years, right? And most of that was a Java, Oracle, bit of Postgres shop, right? I did that for 10 years, and I got to the end of a 10-year cycle and just felt I could do anything I want to with Java, but I was too wearied of writing Java programs to bother. And I left that company kind of exhausted by what I thought at the time was the only way of doing programming, which was an object oriented language of some stripe connected to a relational database of some stripe. And I went looking for other ways of thinking about programming, other, like fundamentally other. And at first I tried Python and was disappointed because it wasn't different enough. And I think I dipped into Prolog, and that was different enough, but not actually very useful.
Why not Lisp?
Well, then I heard about Lisp, and I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. And I heard about Clojure, and I thought, okay, great, JVM. I know JVM. That's a safe place to learn something new. And I never looked back. Once I got into Clojure, introduced me to functional programming, and it was such a different way of thinking about programming, and such a refreshing way, and a simpler, more logical to me way of thinking about programming as just data and ways of changing that data into other data. And I loved it, and I never looked back from that.
Well, I can tell you, I got tired of Java after Hello World. So, um, I, so I am not a programmer. Let me be very clear. I can program. I am not a programmer. All right. So I enjoy when if I'm going to code, it's to solve a very specific purpose.
Mm.
It's something that I'm tired of typing all the commands for. It's something that I need to report. Right. So my
Mm.
go-tos are going to be Bash.
Okay.
I mean, it's just that simple, and especially Python, because Python, no matter how terrible I am, you can still read it, right?
Yeah.
So I can have one
That's
of
the
my
opposite of Perl. Perl, no matter
yes.
how good you are, it's still unreadable.
I moved away from Perl. I used to love Perl because it just kind of it works like a mind works, right? You just kind of flow with it. But I moved away from Perl when I wrote a very large program, and I executed it, and it worked the first time. And the problem was, I'm not still to this day, I don't know if it actually worked, right? It just executed correctly. And I said, no, it scared me. I was like, no. And I went and learned Python, and I just moved on from there. Okay, so the functional program, now I'll admit, I haven't touched functional programming for probably 30 years.
Oh, okay.
I know what it is. But I think it would benefit us for our audience who, I mean, if you think about it, there's a large portion of people out there in the community who live their life in JavaScript, in
Yeah.
Java, in Python. Python's pretty much the fastest growing language at this point, outside with Rust a close second. If you want a weird language, learn Rust. It's weird. I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but it's a
I
little
like
weird.
Rust, yeah.
Well,
It's see, I actually quite I'm drawn to languages like this that say I've got something new. Not just new syntax, I've got something new to add to the conversation about programming.
well,
And Rust's way of dealing with memory, that's a genuinely new thing to add to our conversation. It isn't just, oh, indentation or braces or different kinds of braces, or we put hashes in front of function names.
well, I love the idea of Rust. Hands down, I love the idea that the theory is if it compiles, it won't crash.
Hmm. That
right?
seems like a very
I mean,
reasonable thing to expect from a
and
language,
I would
right?
agree. It's a very reasonable thing. Now, I was actually talking to a buddy of mine, Jim Molczynski. He works for AWS, and he's big into Rust now. And he was talking to me about how it's not perfect. And nothing ever is, right?
Mm,
But he says that there are things they call I think it's called soundness errors, where in obscure corners of the Rust compiler, they haven't quite gotten those out yet. So if you hit one of those, there is an opportunity for failure.
ooh,
But then again, you can only pursue to be better, right? Because if you pursue to be perfect, you fail.
yeah.
So one step at a time.
But it's
Um,
it's not just incrementally better. They are trying for a big leap forward, and I respect that a lot.
I do too. Talk to us a little bit. Give us an idea of, for those who have, I mean, may not even have ever, maybe they heard of it in history books, right? But
Mm,
what is functional programming? I'm a JavaScript developer. Nothing else makes sense because that's how I came into this industry. Uh, I'm working with Mongo, for example,
yeah.
and JavaScript. What is it? What is functional programming? Give me, how is it different?
Okay, so I'd say the way of thinking about solving problems is a big difference. You instead of thinking about objects that you poke at and see how their behavior changes, you are thinking of a stream of data comes in, we change it in some way to produce new data and spit that out. And when I think of it, I have this mental model of like a series of events, values coming in from the world. We change them in some fashion using a function that just takes some data and spits out some different data and sends it on its way. And you build up these networks of little machines that change data in interesting ways. That's the
So
mental model.
chaos theory.
No, no, no. I think it's far more predictable because you have. So the other thing is side effects are a big part of functional programming, which I will define very quickly as unpredictable behavior. You know, adding two numbers always has the same output for the same input. A random function always has a different output for the same input. And querying a row in a database usually has the same output for the same input, but occasionally it changes. You know, certain types of function are incredibly predictable, very testable, very reliable, and functions with side effects are less predictable, less reliable. And functional programming is really deeply concerned about getting a tight control over the unpredictable functions, which I think is a good thing.
Okay.
Uh, Control over the unpredictable is a good thing in programming.
Good catch. Because I was gonna good catch. Because I was gonna say, if you were just gonna leave, if you weren't gonna add the in programming, I was like, now hold on a second.
Yeah, yeah. Do
Exactly
not
how
attempt
much
to apply that
control do
philosophy.
you think you had?
Yeah, don't
Go
attempt to
ahead.
apply that philosophy to your marriage. It will not work.
No, 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 no. Quite a bit of unpredictability that you need to embrace
Yes, yes,
in a
absolutely.
marriage, uh, even if it causes you to day drink. Uh, um, all right, so um, now we did talk about the next topic here in my outline. This is interesting. I so in the world that I'm in, I'm deeply into Postgres, obviously.
Okay, yeah,
Um, Almost everybody we know is running Java, Python, um, some C, some Rust, but really, I mean, let's be honest, it's Java, Python. It's
yeah,
one
yeah.
of those, unless we're automating something with like Salt or Ansible or something like that. Um, you said you're getting a ton of work, contract work for functional, or did for functional programming.
Yeah.
Where are you? Where are you? So not quite this extreme, but I tie this to the idea of, if you know COBOL, you're making six figures, not even
Yeah,
working full time, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because these languages, I mean, you and I are going to be dead before COBOL's finally actually gone,
yeah,
if it ever
yeah,
really is.
absolutely.
Um, so what corners of the world are like, functional programming?
It's yeah, it took me by surprise. I've got to say that I got a lot of work as a contractor in functional programming. and a large part of it is that demand outstrips supply. So it's a small pond, but there are more employers than there are good functional programmers. And that's all you need as a contractor, right? So most of the work I did was a bit for financial houses, where things like Haskell can be very popular for the predictable, analyzable, compile it works kind of behavior. And a lot for startups especially startups that want to try something new and not necessarily go with the default choices. Their programming teams see a green field as a chance to get at the fundamental problems they had at the last company. So,
I can see that. I mean,
no, go on.
I know a gentleman who was big in the Perl world, that went from Perl to Smalltalk of all things.
Oh, okay.
And he was so busy he doesn't even answer emails anymore. It's a very small pond, but he was one of the only ducks floating in it. So
Yeah.
I can see that. Let's move on to something that, well, I guess we both have technology. Now this is interesting. You went from developer to developer advocate.
Yes, I did. Yeah. There's another career
Now,
move I
I'm going to
didn't see
poke the
coming.
bear a little bit here.
Mm.
Just poke the bear a little bit. That sounds to me like you went from I can code to I can no longer code. So tell me.
Bear poke.
So tell me the difference. Set me straight.
So towards the end of my contracting days, I was, programming for 40 hours a week because I love it. And on the side, I was speaking at conferences. I was organizing hackathons. I did a monthly hack night in London for about 4 years. I wrote, I did a bit of video stuff. Programming in itself was great, but I also wanted to talk to programmers and build stuff and tell people what about the things I've been building and do community stuff. And it's as simple as someone came along and said, we love what you're doing during the day. We love this stuff you're doing outside. Do you want to get paid to do both at once? And as a developer
And the answer
advocate,
was
I got to
yes.
spend a chunk of my time building interesting things and a chunk of time talking about the things I built and a chunk of my time talking to people about what they built. It was great.
Follow-up passion project, basically.
Yeah. I got paid to be in the world I love.
Did you get into mentoring at all?
Never formally. I mean, I've always had those kinds of conversations and been happy to help out people whenever I can, and have done along the way. But I never had like a weekly meeting with my mentee type relationship. That's just never come
Fair
up.
enough.
Yeah.
So, how did it change your relationship to technology, though? Because what I heard you say is you're now doing both. Did becoming a developer advocate maybe open your mind to problems you may not have seen before that allowed you to apply it backwards?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference it made was you start to see more than just the technology picture. So you start to think, well, I love Elm. Elm's great. But you can't hire a team of Elm programmers into a bank, right? No matter how good the technology is, you've got to think of the hiring concerns, you've got to think of the team management concerns, you've got to think of the time to market for the business. And just it gave me a picture into the wider context of how computing decisions are made by a business. Sometimes very well, sometimes not so well, but there are lots more factors to consider.
Well, now this is a thread I want to pull on a little bit, because as someone who came up in the era like yourself, where to a lot of people we were almost wizards.
Yeah.
Right. They did not understand what we did on any level. It was, I'm supposed to push a button and this is supposed to come out. If it doesn't come out, I got to call down to the help desk or whatever.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder and then of course you end up with oftentimes technical people have quite the ego.
That's a risk.
Yeah.
And I think
I've
got to say, I think it's a kind of a reasonable risk, because we we spend 40 hours a week dealing with a machine that really holds us to account, suffers
Hmm.
no crap, right? And when most of your working relationship is with a machine that says you're either right or you're wrong, can't help but shape our minds sometimes to then go and talk to a human being and see everything a bit binary. And we have to remember, we have to not lose that human connection. But I have some sympathy for
Well,
people that start to be conditioned by the machine.
and that's actually where I'm going with this because of your comments about developer advocate. I almost wonder if so. You know the OSI model, I'm sure, and
OSM?
the OSI model, the
Oh, yeah,
seven
sorry. Yeah.
layers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so one of the fundamental things that is missing in today's technical people, and fundamentally missing, is a misunderstanding of the diagnostic model. They just have no idea.
Okay.
And so what happens is instead of starting at 0, they jump to like 5. And then they wonder why they don't get and then the person that starts at 0 finds the answer to the problem so much faster because they're not going 5, 7, and then back round,
Mm.
right? So I wonder, what if the junior developer, the one that comes in, yes, we let them do developer work, obviously, because that's what, but what happens if we make them the developer advocate first? So they have to learn the the other bits so that you don't get my boss is an idiot, he doesn't know what he's talking about. When in fact the boss does know what he's talking about, the engineer is ignorant of all the other variables that are driving the decisions.
Mm. I think that's tricky because I think being a developer advocate actually to be usefully a developer advocate requires quite deep technical roots as well.
That's
You
I would agree with that.
and I think to go into it without serious experience of programming, I don't see how you bridge that gap. You need a deeper knowledge. So I think the solution to that actually is that we should have more programmers, junior programmers, also doing client work, also talking directly to the clients. Right. Um, I've worked at software houses where programmers never speak to the end user. And I've worked with
Right.
software houses where even the junior programmers are expected to go on site and sit down with the user and see what they're actually typing. And I think that's invaluable.
I would agree, and I would also like to clarify: a client is not necessarily outside the business, right? It's
Oh,
the
true. Yeah.
user of your software,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's kind of like eating your own dog food, right? You think you did it in a way that made sense, but then when it gets to the person who has no idea how you did it, they're following, a PDF instructions or something, you're going to get, usability errors. You're going to get, oh, that doesn't make sense. You're going to get visual reactions from the user themselves about, oh my God, why did this red thing blink at me? Just to,
Yeah.
make a better experience as a whole, and you're going to learn a lot from that. Not only that, not only just from the code, but I agree with you. I think that having a fundamental understanding of the client and their needs makes you a much better programmer.
Yeah.
Um, and it extends beyond, as someone who employs, we have like a team of 20.
Mm.
And I'm one of the people that goes in when I go to a client, it's because I have someone who has no idea how to talk to a technical person. So I'm in the middle,
Right. Yeah.
right? Technical person has no idea how to talk to the CEO. CEO has no idea how to talk to the technical person. So I understand what the CEO is saying and I translate and I end up being, the Star Trek translator dude.
Yeah.
And it's effective in two ways. One, because I am able to help the leadership understand what they are what they are saying and how it's being interpreted, but the other side as well, right? Being able to actually bridge that gap of communication. And what I've found is the more we do that, the less I have to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
As the
Absolutely.
CEO learns how the developers are interacting, the developers learn how the CEO is interacting, they need me less and less.
Yeah.
And then I only get pulled in when someone's angry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
which is the unfortunate reality. But go ahead.
The thing that annoys me somewhat in our industry is if you look at like the Agile Manifesto, everybody talks about Agile. You look at the Agile Manifesto, and the idea you need programmers to sit with users is right in there, front and center. And then you go to
Yes.
a Agile training, or you go to you look at like a SAFe diagram, scaled
Mhm.
Agile framework for enterprise. You can't find users or talking with the users in half of those things. But it's the absolute fundamental thing of Agile is speak to the people who are using this.
So the reason I hate Agile, I hate it, and not because I hate what it is in practice,
Yes. Yeah.
right? The If you were to follow the methodology correctly, like you said, I absolutely see where that could be exceedingly useful.
Hmm.
But what developers did is they turned it into break it as fast as you can, as many times as you can until it works.
Yeah.
And the problem is that's why you never stop developing, which is good for them. I think what happened is that managers loved the idea of continuous improvement of an application because managers often change their mind about not really what they want, but how they want it.
Hmm.
And developers kind of fell in love with the idea of always doing something new, even if it's related. Now, I don't think it's all developers because I know a lot of developers that absolutely despise the way that Agile's been implemented. They want
Hmm.
to actually solve a problem and move on to the next problem. They don't want to solve a problem and then change the question,
Yeah.
right? Um, but have you ever seen it properly done, like by
Um,
the book?
I have. I think, in fairness, I'm going to defend developers a bit before I move on to answer that question, because I think one mistake that managers make is they love the idea of getting more features more quickly, and I've
Mhm.
never seen managers say, "Okay, so in this sprint, we're going to do exactly what we did in the previous sprint, but we're going to iterate on it and improve it." That's fundamentally supposed to be part of Agile. Not that we do one feature for one sprint and then a different feature and a different feature, different feature. That we will iterate for several sprints over the same feature, making it better and better. Nobody does that.
That's as it should be.
Mm. And I have seen it done, but not under the name Agile. I've seen it done in small software houses where it was done in the name of quality.
Right.
And I don't think, if you actually look at the Agile Manifesto, if you've actually read it, there's just a lot of sensible stuff you discover on your own. And we somehow got away from the sensible manifesto into move fast and break things and never revisit the mistakes you made. And I
Well,
don't
as
know
a
why.
database person, that just makes me twitch.
Yeah. Yeah. And it should.
You
It should
know?
make us all twitch, management and programmers alike, and especially users.
Well, yeah, because users expect a consistent experience,
Mm.
right?
We
It's always change. I mean, there's a reason why users revolt hard. I mean, over things you wouldn't think of. When Reddit went from the old to the new, the revolt
mm.
was astronomical. And it wasn't that the old was better or that the new was better. It's just that it was different, and they didn't want the change.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
and it was a
absolutely.
massive change, right? It wasn't like they added a button, right? It was a massive boom. One day you logged in, it's a whole new website.
Well, see, I think
Um,
part of that is the last thing you want when you go to do anything and you're trying to just get a job done to find that everything's changed underneath you. That's really irritating to anybody.
well, nobody wants to relearn the same thing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, Linux as a whole. I mean, I've been running Linux since 92 or 3. I mean, before 1.0 was released. And it was all console stuff back then. X was just nowhere near usable. Uh, and I remember when like 0.99 of KDE came.
Mm.
And to this day, even though I don't use KDE anymore, I just use GNOME. I can load up KDE and I still basically know how to use it. All the fundamentals are the same.
Mm.
GNOME is very similar, right? And it's one of these things where it's okay to add a feature, it's okay to improve, but your core productivity can't change,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The same GNOME that I ran 10 years ago, the core productivity hasn't changed. I still say, Alt F4 to kill a window. I still, hit the Windows button when that finally became a thing and it pops up the little dialogue so I can search for something. All those types of things are still the same. Even though I'm running Wayland, I'm not running X anymore. The underlying things have changed significantly, but the core productivity of the system, whether it be GNOME, LibreOffice, Chrome, I don't run
Yeah.
Chrome, I run Brave, but it's all the same.
I think what you're saying is
Um,
fundamentally that I'm right to still be using Emacs.
I will say fundamentally, if it is productive for you, my friend, please absolutely use Emacs. You're
Yeah.
still wrong. Well, actually, let's talk about Emacs for a second. We're running a long time, but this is actually an interesting thing that you brought up. Do you remember X Emacs?
I don't think I do. No.
So this happened back when RMS was still dealing with Emacs code,
Right.
and there was some kerfuffle, for lack of a better word, where one group got tired of the other group, and they split off and they created X Emacs.
Right.
And for a long time, X Emacs was actually the better Emacs. Now Emacs now is far overtaken and it's no longer maintained or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting paradigm. I've had conversations with this with a lot of deep members of the .org, PostgreSQL.org community.
Hmm.
One of the things about open source, do you remember X386?
Very vaguely.
Okay, so X386 was what everybody ran, the free X Windows system,
Hmm.
until they changed the license.
Right.
The day they changed the license, another community came along, all the community disagreed with them,
Mm-hmm.
forked it from that license commit, the one commit before that,
Yeah.
forked it, and now anyone running X Windows is now running that, and the X386 community is dead. I mean, you can go to x386.org and you can look at the tree, it's dead. And one of the things I've always advised, people in the PostgreSQL.org community about is that you have to be careful. Any open source community is that remember that it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a core member, you can be the founder, you can be the BDFL.
Yeah.
If you exert the wrong kind of influence, your community will leave you, and your contributions will be forgotten.
Yeah.
You yourself, you and I have been in this industry similar amounts of time. You didn't even remember X386, and they were fundamental to the adoption of Linux for well over a decade.
Yeah. Yeah.
People will forget you.
I think what we're talking about really is change management, whether it be the user interface of Reddit or, I mean, I'd like to see people change the way they program, but how do you manage that change? Because if you can't suddenly switch. You can't suddenly have people wake up one day and tell them they're now doing things a different way. Forget what you were planning to do today. You've got to learn the new way of doing it.
It's always got to be incremental,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it has to be through positive influence.
Yes. And then you get something like, this is going back a little way. So Subversion versus Git, right? Linus Torvalds once said that Subversion was the dumbest project ever because it was trying to be a better CVS, and there's no way to
Correct.
do CVS better. And it's like, Git is a fundamentally different way of doing things, and I think it's fundamentally better. But if Subversion had woken up one morning and the interface was suddenly Git, that would have been suicide. How do you
Correct.
get people to make fundamental improvements to our industry without just killing it on the vine because you ruined the experience for people?
I think that there's a couple of ways. So there's two sides to what I'm about to say. One is it has to be incremental.
Mm.
right? You can't, like you said, you can't just say we're moving to Git. I mean, PostgreSQL.org was one of the last major projects to move away from CVS to Git. And it was a constant, I mean, it was a battle. I mean, a battle.
Yeah, I can believe.
Yeah. And I think one of the mistakes people make, and I think probably everybody does this, but since I'm in the technical world, I'm going to stick with technical people. I think that technical people have a specific vision, but it doesn't go far. The vision isn't necessarily very far. A lot of times it is just to the next door that opens to a feature or whatever. So when you do something like all of a sudden you open the door and there's 50 doors in front of you, kind of like Neo in the Matrix when he goes into the hallway, right? You don't know which one to pick.
Yeah.
It all of a sudden it's overwhelming. And so you immediately revert back to this is good enough. However, if you have someone who can describe the vision from a top-down perspective, this is why we're going here. This is how we're going to get here. This is why it's positive. Not necessarily better, right? Because the current thing already works. So saying something's better is arguable no matter what, right? As long as you're getting the positive return on what you're using, saying something better, that's a difficult thing for people to swallow. Saying that Git is better than CVS, well, CVS has worked for decades. Why is Git better?
Oh,
Right?
I think it is, and I'm not sure I want to put myself on the
Well, I know
spot, but yeah, I no, I think
I agree
we are
with you that Git
striving
is
for a
better.
better world.
Yes. But first off, let me say I do agree that Git is better than CVS, no question.
Okay.
But it's how you explain it. It's a more positive experience. It allows for decentralized programming. It allows for you to merge large differences amongst many developers in a more logical way or a more productive way versus it's better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If you take a slower top-down education, I would think that the experience would be better on the change.
Yeah. This relates to, I mean, it relates to Kafka, it relates to functional programming for me. It's like, I think there are fundamentally simpler and more reliable ways of programming. But I think it would be a terrible mistake to hijack people onto that way of working. I've seen that fail many times. I'm also not sure it's a great idea to make something like Java incrementally more functional and end up with something that's a bit of a chimera that's not quite one or the other. And I think that was for me, that was the mistake that Scala made. It asked the question, can you be object oriented and functional at the same time? And whether they like to admit it or not, I think the answer was no.
I think that there's fundamental differences in those paradigms, right?
And you've got to
It's
come
not
up.
that they're black and white.
You've got
You
to
got to
kind of come
go
up
ahead.
with a theory that unifies the two if you're going to stick them in the same place. And I don't think anyone's done that yet.
Which I don't know that I agree with you. I don't think anyone's done it, and two, I'm not sure if it's even possible.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll give you another one you might like on the same lines. I don't think anyone has come up with a model that unifies object orientation and relational databases. And I think that's why all our ORMs are horrible hacks that break down very easily.
no, I agree with that 100%. In fact, it's something that Postgres struggled with for a long time because Postgres technically is an object relational database. And they finally dropped that naming because so many people would come into the community and they would confuse object relational with object oriented.
Yeah.
And it was always a long discussion and they couldn't wrap their heads around it. So they just dropped that part of it because it's not even really, it's not an evolved part of the system. It's just how it was originally built. But I want to get it. There's a couple other things here that we should get in because I think you and I could talk about this all day long. Honestly, we've got some interesting information on Boolean Vault.
Yeah.
So I'll give you some points here I want to get to so we don't forget. Boolean Vault, I definitely want to touch on, but also podcasting because you do podcast. and what's next for you? Because as I understand it, you are no longer with your former
This is
entity.
true. Yes, yes. So a few people will know that there have been layoffs in the tech industry recently.
A few,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah, that news may not have escaped your notice. Yeah, so I'm currently between jobs, which is actually enormous fun in every respect
Hmm,
except the income, you know.
right.
I'm getting a chance to build some stuff I've had on my backlog to build for a while. I'm going to sit down and play with Rust a bit more because that's been, Um, so I've got a bit of a window, which I'm enjoying. And one of the things I'm
Uh,
planning to do with that window is to start. I used to host the podcast for my previous company. I'm going to start my own podcast
Fantastic.
because I love doing it.
On Rust, real quick. Look into PGRX.
PGRX.
Yep.
Making a
It
note of that now.
is. I actually know the primary developer personally. It is how you write Postgres extensions in Rust.
Ooh. Oh, that's
Yes.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting stuff coming out from that. So I would take a look at that. There's also now a PL Rust, so you can write Postgres procedures in Rust.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so
That
something
should
to
be
do
fun.
in the spare time that you currently have. But let's talk about podcasting. You used to run podcasts at your former employer,
Yeah.
um, and I won't say who it was. They can find out on their own, probably searching for you, not that hard.
Yeah.
But I will say this because you probably can't. What they did to you was not the layoff. That's just part of business. Sometimes that happens.
Hmm.
But what they did after the layoff is it's foul. It's inhumane. It really, as someone who's a published author, as someone who works hard to bring information to the people that are willing to listen to him, it's just downright rude, right? It's not civilized in any manner. I mean, I don't care what culture you're from. I don't know of a single culture outside of maybe communism that thinks that it's okay to remove a person's identity and art from the general populace, or at least the authenticity of it. It was just wrong, and I am sorry that that happened.
Well, thank you. There's not much I want to say on record about that whole episode. But
Sure, and that's okay.
do you know what? Right now, I'm in a place where I say I think I recorded about 60 odd episodes that we published, and they're all still available, and I celebrate them for what they were. They were just a joy to record, to talk with all those different developers and learn from them. And yeah, the circumstances of the layoff were nasty. Let's focus on the positive.
Let's focus on the positive. Talk to me about what you're doing with podcasting now. What are you creating?
So the one thing, so the podcast I worked on was very Kafka centric, which is great because it's one of my interests. But
Hmm.
not but and I've always wanted to go beyond just that, to say, yeah, let's talk about Kafka, let's talk about functional programming, let's talk about what new languages people are creating, what are people doing. And I wanted to just do a broader developer podcast. So I'm actually recording the first episode tomorrow with a guy called Louis Pilfold, who's invented a language called Gleam. Have you heard of Gleam?
I have not.
It's a statically typed programming language for the platform that that Erlang uses.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you like
Interesting.
Erlang, but you find the syntax weird and you want static typing, then maybe you go to Gleam, and we're going to be talking about that.
Fantastic. Well, I must say, when I first got into this is our third year podcasting on
Oh, wow.
casting. And I use, as any good person does, they use their network, right? So
Yeah.
I've had VPs of Google, VPs of VMware, I've had CTOs of MongoDB, I've had AWS on, and I loved all of it. But the one thing I really loved was when I started I got an oncologist on who is responsible for
Oh,
research of breast cancer.
Mm.
Because originally the podcast started as basically it's about data and the people who wrangle it. Well, an oncologist is dealing with a lot of data.
Yeah, yeah.
And some interesting challenges that she had within the U.S. medical system because of privacy laws and different state privacy laws and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we also got people that, Dr. Loren Starr, she's a PhD who specializes in inclusion and diversity. So a lot of different, it started getting different aspects. I even had a gal on who, she's one of the only, if not the only, female owners of an ammunition manufacturer.
Ooh, didn't see
Yeah.
that one coming.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So we
Yeah.
really just finding really interesting people to talk to, because it's easy. You and I can shoot the breeze all day long. We come from the same basic sphere.
Yeah.
Right. But when you start bringing people that are related, but only in a very distant kind of tangible way, it gets very interesting.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to continue that, because I think that there's a lot of room to learn, especially like you said, if people are developing new programming languages now,
Yeah.
they definitely have a certain bent to them that should be
Yeah.
explored.
That's a topic we're going to talk about, the slight madness of creating a new programming language.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
All right. So, hey, what about Bullion Vault? Was this your startup that you were talking about previously?
Yeah, yeah. So that's the one I co-founded that in 2003. And essentially I built a stock exchange for precious metals. We had a
Okay.
business guy, a marketing guy, and a technical guy was me. And we built up, if you're the kind of person that would like to buy a bar of gold, but you want to, firstly, you want to store it, you want to own it outright. So if the bank collapses, it's still yours. You don't want
Mhm.
a credit allocation of gold, you want an actual bar. But if you're that kind of customer, you probably don't want to have it in your house. You're probably planning for the worst case scenario. So maybe you want to have it underground in a vault in Switzerland. There's actually a surprisingly large market for, I want to own it safely somewhere else. And that's the business we built up. We launched, I think, in about 2004. I think the 20th anniversary of the company being founded is this October. It's still going. If you want to buy gold, head to bullionvault.com. There's my little advert. And yeah, it was one of the most fun things of my career, because I got to build something from scratch and see it grow from an idea in a garage to a launched product I knew I'd always be proud of, even if we never got a user, to a thriving business, which is still going 20 years later.
So it's interesting. I'm sure that this news gets across the pond, as they say. But in the United States, we do have a segment of the population that is survivalists.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? The world is going to end, and therefore I'm going to keep my assets in gold.
yeah.
And so in fact, I employ one of them, and I don't disagree with them. I get the thought process, right? I mean, if you really think about it, pounds or the U.S. dollar or whatever, it's all fictional, right?
Yeah.
At the flip of a switch, it could be worth nothing, right? I mean, right now, Janet Yellen is saying that we might hit our debt ceiling by June 1st. We hit our debt ceiling and we don't pay our debts, which is not going to happen. But if that doesn't happen, the world's financial system collapses.
Yeah.
Right? It
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
matter how much is in my TD Ameritrade, it will be worth zero. So I definitely think you hit on something. Why did you, I mean, are you still an owner? Did you leave outright? Is it?
Yeah, so I still own a share of it. I left when I realized I would become a full-time manager, and I would never, if I stayed, I would never be able to program again. We'd just grown too big, and I was the CTO, and my hands were coming completely off the wheel. And then my first child came along, and we had a big raft of investment, and I thought, you know what? I've made I've done comfortably from this, and you've got to start asking what do you actually want to do with your life. And for me, it wasn't management.
Well, sir, hats off to you on that one because management's. I'm to enjoy management. I mean, don't get don't confuse. Be very clear. Don't confuse leadership with management.
Yes.
Leadership can be very empowering,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you can really help people with proper leadership. Management is about being a parent, and it's terrible. It's
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah,
I mean, and as someone who is sometimes managed, right? I'm 49 years old and I'm sometimes managed. I can't imagine trying to manage me. I am insufferable.
After this chat, I'm going to feel like, yeah, that would be tricky. You're heading in your own direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems that we run into is that I'm infinitely unemployable. Right. I have worked for myself since 1997. My last job that I was fired from, by the way, was 1999. Not a single person has controlled my paycheck but me since then.
Yeah.
So that makes I can be difficult to manage. If Amanda were in the room, she'd be doing cheerleader dances right now because of me saying that.
You're on record. You're on
But yeah,
record. She can play it back as
I
often
am
as she
on
likes.
record. Yeah, that's exactly right. I can't believe he admitted it. I can't believe he admitted it.
Yeah.
All right. As Lindsay, our producer, is actually sitting. She just chatted me and said, "I'm doing cheerleader dances." She gets nervous because sometimes I don't show up until 2 minutes before the podcast.
Oh god. Yeah.
Right? It's like, is he gonna show up? Is he okay? And it bless her, she's just trying to do a good job and make sure that everything goes off without a hitch. But I'm like this morning. I mean, I showed up like 7 minutes before the podcast because I hadn't done one in a while, and everything was in disarray. Like, where's the camera? Where's the mic? Where's the laptop? All that, trying to get all that situated. Yeah. Exactly. As we close this out, because it's getting long, and I know it's late where you're at, and gin o'clock is how you put it. So I'm going to ask you one question about gin. I'm going to ask you one question about gin, and then I'm going to ask you about 08, and then we'll close out.
Okay.
What is your favorite gin?
Bombay Sapphire.
Okay, that's a decent gin. I have two, and they're very similar. They're very similar, very different price points in exceedingly different countries.
Okay.
Hendrix.
Yeah,
I
solid.
love Hendrix. I love Hendrix. But Japan has one called Roku. Roku.
We've got some of that in the cupboard that was given to me, and I'm not sure I've ever opened it.
You should. It is, when you taste it, you're going to be like, that's Hendrix. No, it's not Hendrix. It's very close, cost half as much. It's a lovely gin. But I only drink gin as a martini. I don't drink it as like gin and tonic.
Gin and tonic it's a great way to start an evening.
Well, I enjoy gin and tonic, but martinis all the way.
Fair enough. Very, very sophisticated.
Thank you. As you know, as sophisticated as an American can be.
No comment, Your Honor.
my coffee drinking American. All right, so let's talk about 08. How did 08 affect bullion vault? Now, for 08, we're talking about the financial collapse, Lehman Brothers.
Well, this relates to what you're saying, like survivalists, right? Because we had a gold business, and survivalists were a customer segment. And also there were people who just thought, I'm just going to put 5% of my portfolio in something really safe. Right, something that will be fine if everything else goes badly. But we were saying, we had spent between 2003 when we started and 2008 saying to people, why do you want to store gold? Why do you want to make sure you own the gold outright? It's because your bank could collapse. And if you're a creditor, you're screwed, right? And people say, well, banks don't collapse.
Well, that hasn't happened recently.
Yeah, and like... And so, like 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, simultaneously, all the friends and family who thought we were mad for the past 5 years suddenly got it. And we had the busiest day selling gold in our entire history. We were just rushed off. It was mostly automated, and we were still rushed off our feet with new customers.
So, how have you? Well, I don't know how much you're involved with it now as just a shareholder, but what did you see change through that, right? Because we just had Silicon Valley Bank. I think the UK branch sold for $1 or a
Really? Oh,
pound.
God.
Yeah. We just had First Republic. This isn't '08, so if you're listening to this, don't freak out. This isn't '08. We're much better prepared for what's going
Yeah.
on.
Are we?
But there's
Yeah,
been
let's say we are.
well, let's just hope that we are. But there's been a few, and we've been, I think the financial instruments and regulators have been a lot more proactive about let's grab it now so that we don't have this domino effect that we had in '08.
Yeah.
Right. But why do you think we all know that physical assets are better than any financial instrument,
Do
right?
we?
What?
Do we all agree with that?
Okay. Well, apparently not, because that's kind of where I'm going. Is
Yeah.
like, to me, I go buy land,
Yep.
right? Go get yourself some, or especially if you're in the West in the U.S., find a way to buy some water rights.
Yeah.
Those are instruments. And to be fair, I have land, I don't have water rights, but and I do have money in the market because that is kind of, it's really the only way to, generally speaking, if you're smart about it, guarantee a return over time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you look historically speaking, if you hold on to it long enough, you will get unless you're just investing in stupid things, you're going to get some kind of positive return, either through a dividend or through just inflationary percentages, things like that.
I feel like I should switch to my disclaimer voice. This podcast does not guarantee any financial advice. Please do your own research before investing. Prices may go up as well as down.
Absolutely, and they may completely disappear.
Yeah.
That's actually, we are not licensed brokers here. We're just shooting the shit.
Yeah.
But why is it? Is it the allure of a potential windfall? Why are we so willing to risk it all by putting everything we have into something that largely is non-tangible? Right? Companies are trading at values that are not reality.
Yeah, God, that's a very big question for which this little old programmer doesn't quite feel qualified to answer. I know that a big part of the appeal of gold was having something tangible at the foundation of your portfolio, right? Something that, if everything else evaporated in a puff of numbers, would still be there. And the nice
there's definitely a sense of security.
Yeah. And it's like one thing we always used to think about in those days at Bullion Vault was things like hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, right? You got hyperinflation, money has become worthless. One of our customers, I think, sent me a $1 trillion note once in the mail. Was it 1 trillion Zimbabwean? I think it was 1 trillion. It could have actually been higher. And, he just bought a bunch of them and sent them on eBay and sent them over for fun. So the Zimbabwean dollar was worthless. And then you've got the people that own land, and they're kind of in trouble too, because they can't get out of the country with their assets, which they may want to do. And there was always that appeal of having enough money to live off in something safe like gold, offshore, where you might want to go to and live. And it wasn't a survival.
And Switzerland.
Yeah, Switzerland, London. We had New York because the people in London didn't want to buy in London. The people in Switzerland didn't want to buy in Switzerland. And it wasn't so much a survivalist thing as I've worked hard all my life to save all this money. And I've invested some of it in high risk and some of it in medium risk and some of it in low risk and some in absolutely if all else fails.
Fair
And
enough.
that's the business we were in. It's a good business it is.
All right. As we close out, is there anything that you would like to add?
We've barely talked about Kafka, but I think we'll have to save that for another episode. That wasn't
Well,
deliberate. We talked about it a lot, but
we should talk about Kafka on another episode. I'd love to have you again.
cheers.
It has been absolutely, I mean, interesting how we started off pretty geeky, right?
Yeah.
And we just kind of deviated out. And I really enjoy those types of conversations. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today was Kris Jenkins. Kris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.